Howdy y'all, I am Ice Gold, and today we've actually got a pretty interesting one. Over the last year, I have made what looks like 9 tier lists where I rank every single matchup in Wiz PvP, and I take a look at, who's performing better, who's performing worse, like what schools are doing good, not doing so good, and of course there's been some constants throughout, but for others there's been a bit of fluctuation, and of course it has been a year since I made this first tier list on the 27th of June 2024, and I've since made them on August 13th, October 3rd, November 12th, December 19th, January 23rd. There was a prediction that I made when I wasn't doing PvP at the end of February, but I am not going to count that here since it's not concrete. And then April 3rd, May 22nd, and of course most recently June 30th, that being yesterday. So today we are going to be taking a look at all of these matchups and analyzing how they've evolved over the past year and over these 9 tier lists, and we're going to see just sort of, has one school gotten better against another since the beginning? And some of these data points, and I will say right now, as a political scientist, I love data. It is so interesting to me to just sort of look at some of the stuff like this, but for some of these data points, like if we're talking about from, of course, June 27th, this was back when Wraith was still Wraith, and you can definitely tell how that was looking back at the time. But yeah, we're gonna just take a look and see at how every school has sort of evolved since the June 27th tier list, just sort of how they've done over the last year. And yeah, we're gonna take a look at that, and then I also have this other tier list right here with just 2 tiers and the 7 schools. We're gonna go over this at the end of the video, just like I always do with these tier lists, and we're going to look at what schools have been getting better as in a positive trend, or getting worse as in a negative trend. So balance changes have happened. Like a ton of balance changes have happened throughout this last year, and we're just going to take a look at sort of all of that in this video today. So what I mean is, for the tier list itself with these 5 categories, I guess a tilt, lean, I don't know if maybe I should have changed these beforehand, but if I put a matchup like Death versus Balance into the tilt category, that would mean Death has gained slightly against Balance in the last year. Whereas, usually, like on the last one, it was still very safe for the Balance, but for this tier list, this is basically like, has Death gotten better against Balance? And if it has, by like the tiniest possible margin, I would put it here. And then, of course, lean, likely, safe, and one-sided. It's like if Death has gotten a lot better against Balance, that's where I'd put it here. So with that being said, it's already been 3.5 minutes. Let's start looking at some of these. So first off, we are going to go over Balance versus Death. Back in the day, this was a very interesting matchup. Balance versus Death back during the Wraith meta was kind of aggressive, I'll say. I already had to drink water. That's not a good sign. Anyway, so yeah. Back a year ago, Death did do better against Balance because of how Wraith was, and of course this was after Hydra had gotten nerfed, and Scales was still its own thing, but ultimately Death was leaning more on Wraith than anything back in June of 24. So with this in mind, if we take a look at sort of, because it flipped violently after the Wraith change on the 31st of July last year, so if we're taking a look at it from this particular set of data, then Balance would have trended pretty hard toward, like this matchup trended pretty hard toward the Balance, just because it got, like coming from here, it got much better over the last year, because here on August 13th it was safe, on October 3rd it was safe, It was apparently a top 5 worst matchup in the game, as I determined on November 12th. And then December 19th. This was an interesting one. I think, because this would have been right after Mana Burn and Supernova got banned. So that would have been, I think I might have given Death like a slight edge here, or at least like brought it back a little bit, but then, you know, we got into January and it was back here. So ultimately speaking, I guess balance versus Death, we said this was likely balance back on April 3rd, likely balance again on May 22nd, and now it's back down to safe on June 30th. So I think in terms of how this matchup has trended, it's only really gotten better for balance. But I wouldn't say it's gotten too much better. Like, I wouldn't say it's trended overwhelmingly into the safe category for balance. Like, I think if we're looking at it from, you know, this point in time where Death was slightly beaten balance, then I think this is probably accurate. But in terms of everything else, I mean, there was just this one list here where I was not with Cass on this one, so where I put it as lean balance. That sort of maybe changed things up a little bit, and then it ended up in the likely category. But all in all, this has trended toward the balance, but not really an insane amount. So balance has gotten better against Death over the past year by like a good bit, but not like overwhelmingly. So that's where we're going to put it here. Balance versus Fire. Let's take a look at this one. A year ago, I said this was likely Fire, and then likely balance like a month and a half later, and then it stayed there after about 2 months. It stayed there again after another month. Flipped. So yeah, that would have been a flip from November 12th to December 19th. And then it stayed there January 23rd. And then it swung like back down toward like a really close tilt Fire matchup on April 3rd. And then it stayed there May 22nd. And now on the most recent one, I've said it's lean Fire. So it's looking like most of these lists have Fire favored, but I don't think it'll be by as much. I think balance has gained just a tiny bit on Fire over the last year or so. So yeah, because we had the October 3rd. Yeah, Yeah, I think that's what we'll say. I think balance has barely gained on the Fire School in terms of this matchup. Like, balance is just performing better against Fire now than it was throughout this past year. That sort of deal. So balance beating Fire. Well, balance is not beating Fire, but it has a better chance against Fire than it did for most of the last year. So there's that. Balance versus Ice. This one has fortunately, we finally have an instance where, you know, this has trended toward the Ice, because, you know, of course, Mana Burn and Supernova kept it down in the one-sided tier for the first 4 of these tier lists, and then the Mana Burn ban happened, and we got it down to a likely margin, then a lean margin in January, and then, yeah, back to a likely balance margin. Ice has never been favored in this matchup, but it has definitely gained an overwhelming amount. I think the only way I could put something in one-sided is if a matchup like flipped from being one-sided, and I don't think that's happened for balance versus Ice at all. But I do think that this is probably the single biggest swing and single biggest trend for any matchup in any direction over the last year. So this, I think, is going to be the biggest gain for anybody, and it's nice seeing that it was the Ice School that gained like that. So there's that. So next is balance versus life. I said this was lean balance, and then safe balance a month and a half later. Same thing after another couple months. Oh yeah, then I put it back down to a tilt margin in November. Then I said balance was beating it in December. But then when I did one with Cass, it went back to being safe, and then that's just where it's been ever since. So yeah, I think this has trended pretty definitively in the balance's direction. I think balance, compared to what it was a year ago when life was still, spamming heals, it's like gnomes was sort of running amok, that sort of deal. So that, it's like, balance was worse against healing a year ago, I guess, than it is today. And with that in mind, like some balances aren't even weaving storm anymore, or death or anything that counters heals, because cards like Rainbow Serpent, which got added, between this one and this one, really did help balance in this matchup. So I think balance, having trended very positively in this matchup, it's like a year ago, it was closer, you had to be more on your guard as a balance in this matchup, but I do think that it's trended pretty hard and pretty heavily toward the balance over the past year. There was this one little outlier, December 19th, but balance, honestly, a lot of these data points for balance on this December 19th tier list, I made this video actually not that quickly after the update, but this is about like a month or so after the Mana Burn and Supernova ban, and that, I think, influenced like putting balance kind of down for a lot of this list. So this one was kind of an outlier in that regard. So was the Death School on the first one. So just something to keep in mind. I do think that, yeah, maybe I don't put this here then, and maybe I put this here into the likely category, because it definitely has trended toward balance. But I was kind of saying like a safe trend just because of this one time when life was up. So yeah, of course, like these are not going to be perfect. Do I even have these correctly? I might not. Okay, so this is the real May 22nd one. Good to know. I was oops, but it's okay. This one, it's still more or less the same. It's like balance having or seeing these positive trends. I mean, it's not too surprising there. So yeah, the next one up is balance versus myth, and back a year ago I said myth was winning this, and I think I've pretty consistently said this. There were times when the gap would shrink a little bit, like the October 3rd tier list, but all in all, I think this one has stayed mostly stagnant, I've noticed. Like January 23rd, I think like Cass and I did eventually say this went safely for the myth, but I don't think that's as accurate today. Though I do think like it's barely moved. I'm gonna be real. I think that we've seen just the slightest of trends toward the myth, though, because yeah, I'm gonna say that myth has gotten slightly better against balance, especially when you got things like attenuate and how playing myth has sort of evolved, and just sort of myth does have a lot of counters to what balances can do, and they've definitely like gotten, I won't say buffed, but it's like the play style of a myth versus the play style of a balance. They do kind of clash, and myth I think comes out on top there. So yeah, I'm gonna give myth the edge on that one. Balance versus storm is next up, and this was safe a year ago. Then it was still safe on August 13th, and then where'd it go? Went down to leans on October 3rd, and then swung a bit back toward the balance, but then the burn ban happened, and it flipped pretty violently for that list. And then January 23rd came around, and this was when Storm Elf was like peak viability in the meta. So Storm held on to this one even after we gave a lot of these matchups back to the balance in terms of favorability and all that. So Storm did hold on here, and then yeah. Then May 22nd happened. Once the Storm Elf ban happened, between this one and this one, April 3rd, May 22nd, those two lists, after the Storm Elf ban happened, that's when Storm really had a downturn. And you'll notice like how Storm would perform here versus how Storm would perform here. Like it definitely got worse after that patch. So ultimately, with this being back in the safe category for the balance, for different reasons now, I do think that I can say this has trended back in favor of the balance. Like Storm Elf's, just Storm Elf being banned, I think has created just something, because it's like you would see as recently as like April 3rd, Storm had a fighting chance in this matchup, but then the ban happened and it swung violently back, and it flipped since January 23rd and the April 3rd tier list. Like, we did see a flip here, but the needle didn't move too much. Honestly, this matchup saw more movement between April 3rd and May 22nd than it did between January 23rd and April 3rd. So yeah, I mean, that is the power of one card getting banned, and that really affected the Storm School very negatively in this matchup, and it really hurt it a lot. Next up is Death versus Myth, and of course, way back, Death, I had Death beating Myth by a tilt margin back during the Wraith meta, and then after Wraith got nerfed, it became like a top 5 worst matchup in the game, and that is where it has more or less been situated ever since, and for good reason. There's been people who have said like this matchup has narrowed a little, like even I have said like it's gone down a little bit, but I have not had Death ever being favored in this matchup ever since the Wraith meta, and even during the Wraith meta, Myth could still beat it, so that's pretty important as well. But ever since then, it's kind of been just very safe for the Myth. And I mean, we've kind of seen it's been mostly stagnant since the Wraith nerf. But ultimately, I think if we're keeping track of trends, I think we can say that Myth has, when you consider everything, I think Myth has seen a very slight trend, this matchup has seen a very slight trend towards Myth in this matchup, and that I think will have us putting it here as a positive trend for Myth. So there's that to think about. So alright, yeah, Myth over Death in terms of how this matchup has trended. Next on the list is Storm versus Death, and this one we have not seen any movement at all. This has been one of the most stagnant matchups ever, because it was here in the safe category a year ago. Of course, this was like peak Wraith meta, but honestly, like Death's playing more for Wraith helped Storm's case in this matchup a little. Like, they still lost, but it's like Deaths weren't playing as much for things like weaknesses and blade counters. It was mostly just like Ghoul and Wraith. That was kind of all that Death was back in the day. And Storm, had a better chance against them because of it, but obviously still lost. But then, after the Wraith nerf happened, like, this was the only matchup to swing in Death's favor. I guess outside of the Fire matchup too, but that's a whole thing. It's its own thing. So after the Wraith nerf, this one swung aggressively in Death's favor because of how they had to play following that. And ever since, it has been consistently one of the worst matchups ever. It is a very uphill climb for the Storm in this matchup, and I think like that it's just been consistently one of the worst. And I think with that in mind, it's now the second worst matchup in the game as of this most recent tier list. This is the worst it's ever been. I think we can say that this has trended toward the Death. Not by much, but the only reason it's not by much is because it was already maxed out to begin with. So, Death, yeah, it's Death has gotten better against Storm in the last year, and this most recent tier list that I did yesterday, it doesn't even account for the poison change, where it's like an anti-negative aura, and I made this most recent tier list based on poison not being around, but once it is more accessible, I think we might even see it go down to here. I think once that happens, because Storm, one thing that Storm did have was putting negative auras onto Death, and that could maybe influence a little, but ultimately speaking, yeah, once they lose that, it's gonna be, it might even go down to the one-sided tier. I'm not even kidding. That is how bad it is. So yeah, lean, Death, trend, not trending by much, but like I said, it's already maxed out, so that's where it's at. Fire versus Death is the next one, and I did have Death winning this one during the Wraith meta, then it expanded when Death had to like play a lot more for weaknesses. I think Vampire was sort of coming back at around this time, and this was before Purge got added as well, so Fire was kind of, you know, struggling a little bit against Death. So there was that. And then October 3rd, where did I put it here? It was still safe for Death at this point. And then November 12th happened. This Fire started to get better at playing around Death's weaknesses. And then Ammit came out. And that, I mean, Ammit and Ifrit, this tier list was when Fire's reign of terror began, pretty much. It's like Ammit, Ifrit, and Ammit Scion, and just chaining dots with Death's weaknesses on. Like, Fires were hitting through -60s and having it be a good move during this period in the game's history, and that swung the Fire versus Death matchup so aggressively towards Fire. And I mean, it had already narrowed down a little bit. It went from safe Death on October 3rd to lean Death on November 12th, and then it went to safe Fire on December 19th, and that was where it more or less stayed for quite some time. Both of the tier lists I did with Cass, we had it we had Death losing to Fire by a lot, and then, you know, May 22nd, Death started to kind of claw its way back up, and it's continued to do the same. But ultimately speaking, this matchup has trended pretty definitively in favor of Fire, and that, I think, it's been, yeah, I think I'll put it probably furthest to the left. I think it's trended towards Fire, that's for sure. Fire has definitely gotten better in this matchup over the last year. It definitely took a while for Fire to get there. Like, even after the Wraith nerf, it like took its time. But once the Ammit change, or not even the Ammit change, but once Ammit itself came out, that's when this really started to pick up steam and momentum, and that's when this matchup moved in favor of Fire just so heavily. Next on the list is Fire versus Life, and this, because, okay, I put it as lean Life back a year ago, and this was before Weaving came out, so, I mean, every Fire was still using Storm cards like Triton to counter heals, and that, I think, really gave Fire, Fire had a leg to stand on in this matchup because of that. And then it expanded a bit in August, and then, yeah, then between August and October, like, the way Life started to play, it got a lot more heal spammy, and that's where it sort of came down to in the October tier list, and then it stayed relatively stagnant in November, as well as December, because the main thing that changed for Fire between November and December was, of course, the Amulet card coming out and spell fusions and all that. So Fire got a big buff to their dots, which Life directly counters. So it did not really move the needle too much. I think fire did gain a little bit against life, but not much in that particular month or 5 weeks or something like that. And then it stayed there on January 23rd, and yeah, then April 3rd was an interesting list because this violently flipped the matchup in favor of fire. And so I think we mostly said this because like heal counters, like fire just having a heal counter up like a Triton, and this is also around the time when fire started to pack Storm King Artorias, which really helped because then they could rain a fire and life would not be able to keep up with that many dots. So that, I think, is why we put it in the likely tier for April. And then I did say it flipped back in May, back to a Lean's Life matchup, and then I said that it flipped back in the most recent tier list being yesterday. So this matchup has trended toward the fire, in my opinion. It's definitely had its time being like a completely unwinnable matchup. There was a stretch between like October 3rd and like January 23rd when it was just not at all winnable for the fire. But you know, the way that people play evolves, and the April 3rd tier list, Cass, of course, being much more knowledgeable than me on this matchup, did say that it flipped back toward the fire. And just with how fire makes use of their heal counters, I could see that being a thing. My own experience had me flipping this back and then flipping it back one more time. I think this matchup has flipped the most times out of any. I could be wrong, but you know, it flipped here, then it flipped here, and then it flipped here. So like 3 back-to-back tier lists, this matchup has flipped. So we're gonna see how it continues to evolve. But for the time being, I think I'm going to say that fire, just in having flipped the matchup from where it used to be, I think we're going to say that fire has, it's trended like more than enough to where I would put it in the lean category as opposed to the tilt category. So that's where we're at. Fire versus myth is an interesting one, because where did I even put this? I had myth over fire a year ago, and the same thing happened in August, same thing happened in October, and then it flipped in favor of the fire in November, and then Emmett came out, of course, and then it was safe fire pretty much from then onward, although, of course, it did narrow up again in April, just because this was around the time when myth started to really make use of just PvE and PvE strats and all that, just like spamming blades. And that was how this matchup evolved, and eventually in May I said this flipped back in favor of the myth, and then it reduced a little bit in yesterday's tier list, but ultimately this is kind of back where it started. So I think given how dominant fire was in the matchup for a little bit, like when Amit came out and the tier list after that, I think we're going to say that myth has gotten better in this matchup, but not because of anything that like myth has gotten in terms of spell cards. Toth did help it with like PvE and all that, but yeah, ultimately it's like this matchup has seen a lot of flipping. Maybe this has actually flipped more than life versus fire, because it flipped here, and then yeah, no, it held for a while, and then flipped here. Actually, no, it has not flipped more than life versus fire. So yeah, myth has seen a slight improvement in the fire matchup since a year ago. So that's, I think, where it's going to end up. So next on the list is going to be fire versus storm. This one actually has seen an interesting amount of movement. Okay, so August was when the whole catch elf owl thing started. Like, Storm started to really get a handle on things, and then that flipped this matchup from Fire winning it on my first tier list to Storm winning it pretty decisively on the second one. And then that was where it stayed. It ended up being a top 3 worst matchup in October, just because Storm and, you know, Catch, Elf, Shrike, and Owl, it's like those cards really set Storm apart in this matchup and made it like a worse matchup than Death versus Storm in this on this tier list. And that's where I put that. And then from then on, it's been pretty just definitively bad for the Fire. It's like, yeah, it saw a little reduction here in the December tier list, but then, yeah, it went back, and it has just stayed there ever since. Like, it's a very bad matchup for the Fire. It is one of the most lopsided in the game, and I think if we're talking about like how it's trended, then I think Storm has seen improvements, but I don't know, because it's like the elf ban didn't really change things. Like, it forced Shrike instead of elf, so I don't know. I think Storm has seen a slight trend towards, like, a slight favorable trend in this matchup, but it's still not by very much. So Storm has gotten better against Fire. Definitely has gotten better since the first tier list, but if we're considering just everything, then yeah, I think this is a good place to put it. So, okay, what is next? This is going to be Ice versus Death, and Ice was the only school that I had beating Death back during the Wraith meta, and I do stand by that. Ice was very, very good in that meta because, you know, you could just sit under Brace, and Ice honestly had very good answers to Death's sort of kit, because this was before Death really started like weaving into Fire. Once weaving did come out, it's like that's when Death fully switched over to Fire just because of Higher Dragon, but before then, it's like you would see some Deaths dual schooling Fire, but Storm was still more important, and Ice, that was what was still going on at this point in time. So I had Ice beating Death in this one, and I do think that has maintained itself more or less. This matchup has remained in Ice's favor. It went down to a safe Ice rating in October. This would have been after, like, long after the Wraith nerf. So yeah, Ice beating Death, not surprising. It stayed in the safe category, but then in January it started to trend back down a little bit, because after Fusions came out and after Spellweaving came out, this is when Death really started to lean much more into Fire, to the point where it got all the way down to a tilt matchup, down to a tilt rating that Cass and I both agreed on in April. And it didn't see much of an improvement for the Ice School in May, and it is still in that same category today on June 30th. So in terms of, so it's kind of made its way back to where it was a year ago, and once Poison becomes more accessible, I do think we're going to see this matchup flip. So I think we're going to say this is like the slightest trend on this list. Like, this is about as close to dead even as things get. I think Death has gotten better against Ice over this last year, because it's like during the Wraith meta, you know, Death was winning every matchup, including the Myth one, but not the Ice one. And ever since then, I mean, it was sort of all downhill for them, up until Weaving came out and Death got, you know, more used to it. Deaths are packing sometimes like 5 or 6 elephants with that new pet that's out. So it's like once that happened, it's like that being a thing, because that happened in the spring update. That was March. So that would explain when Cass and I made this tier list in April. That would be when this matchup really moved a lot, because I did have it in the likely category in January, and then once deaths were starting to pack like a ton more important shield counters, that's when I moved this one down to the tilt category. So yeah, it hasn't flipped yet, and Ice has maintained its status as the dominant school in this matchup ever since then. Or honestly, all the way through. This matchup has not flipped and is one of the few that hasn't, but it has sure gotten close. It's like ever since the April tier list, things have been getting progressively worse for the Ice, but not enough to flip it. But I do think that once Poison is out, it might flip, but we're just going to have to see on that. So yeah, Death has seen a slight trend, a slight positive trend for Death in the Ice matchup, so that's where we're at there. Next on the list is Ice versus Fire, and this has definitely had a wild history, because back in June of 24, I had this as likely Fire, because Ice could still get the better of a Fire if, you know, we were using things like Tamauji before that got banned, and you know, Frostbite obviously was still very, very good. The TC didn't get banned until the same patch that got rid of Wraith, so Ice definitely had a fighting chance in this matchup. We just had to keep race and pull bubbles, and we would at least have a shot. So that kind of changed after a little while. Like, I moved this into the safe category for the Fire, like sort of bordering on likely, but it did get better for the Fire at that point. And then that's kind of where it stayed for a little bit. But then, like, you know, November 12th, but it was between November 12th and December 19th when this matchup really got bad. Because, like I said, Amulet came out, and that really changed things up for Fire in a lot of its matchups. Like, if you look at this tier list, you can see Fire is beating Balance, it's beating Death, it's beating Myth, it's beating Ice, and all that. It's even got a better ratio against Storm in this one, but then, you know, you see the list before it, and Fire is not beating Myth by as much, it's losing to Death, it's losing to Balance, and it's not even beating Ice by that much. So Amulet alone, and the dawn of the dot meta, just really set Fire above in the Ice matchup, and that certainly, like, that was a real, yeah, I don't really know how to describe it, but it's like the Amulet update just really made this matchup unwinnable for the Ice, and that's where it stood for a while, because there was no effective way for an Ice to counter a Fire dot spamming, and eventually this got to a point, because up to that point, there had only ever been two matchups in the one-sided category, and they were Balance and Life versus Ice. So, you know, eventually we got to the April 3rd tier list, and Cass and I both agreed that this was not winnable for the Ice. Like, this was the worst matchup in the game, worse than even the Life matchup. Because at least in the Life matchup, you could stay on top of your threefolds and, you know, sort of curb their healing a bit, but Fire was unbeatable solely because of Amulet. And like I said, this was also around the time when Fire started using Storm King art, so when Ices would lean on Toiret or Life King art to counter Fire's dots. Like, I think I've mentioned this a bunch of times before, Fire had a 100% win condition in this matchup for quite some time. What they would do was, they would get to max pips, they'd have a buff, maybe a furnace or blade or both, or something like that, and then they would send an Amulet, and if the Ice were to Toiret or Life King art, since both of those are dots to hots, the Fire would send a Storm King art, which is a hots to hots counter, and then the Fire would surge, buff again, and send a rain of fire, and there was no way the Ice could keep up at that point. And couple that with the fact the Fires were still packing a lot of set shields, and Glacial Golem was still a thing in this matchup, that made it very unwinnable for the Ice. However, and of course this held through May of 2025. Like even when life went back down into the one-sided tier, I still thought the fire matchup was worse. Like this was a 95-5 kind of matchup, and there was that. But then the saving grace of the summer update happened, and fires could not infinitely chain dots anymore, and that I did think moved it back down into the safe category. But it is still very, very hard for the ice to eke out a win. Like it's I think this has only ever been shy of the safe category once, and even then it was in the likely category for the fire, and that was back a year ago, before things like Frostbite and Tamuji and all that got banned. So yeah, ice has lost a lot of cards in the last year that would be helpful in this matchup, and yeah, I think because this matchup was already pretty maxed out. It had its time as being one of the worst matchups in the game, but due to recent updates, I think I can say that ice has seen a positive trend in this matchup. It hasn't been nearly enough, but ice is better against fire today than it's been for most of this last year. And I think that is a good sign going forward, but ultimately this is still a matchup that we lose pretty tragically. Speaking of matchups that we lose pretty tragically, let's move on to life versus ice, which was, I'm pretty sure this has the highest number of entries into the one-sided tier, because obviously balance was there all 4 times before the mana burn ban, and then once that happened it went away. Life was also right there next to it, but then, you know, Ice's counters started becoming less useful, because back when Ice was weaving Storm, let me try and find that. When Ice was weaving Storm, I think it would have been the December tier list. When Ice was weaving Storm, I think I said this might be like life plus 50, which was much more winnable for the Ice than it was prior. So Ice's being able to weave Storm gave Ice a significant leg up in this matchup. Like it made the matchup not totally one-sided. But, of course, Ice weaving Storm in a meta where fire still had Glacial Shield and Glacial Golem, and there were like twice as many fires queuing compared to life's, that made our best counters to life worse and just not worth running. So yeah, that's when the matchup started to get worse for the Ice again, because we couldn't pack our counters without losing worse in other matchups, and you know, eventually that translated to the life matchup ending back up in the one-sided tier for a 6th time out of 9. So 2/3 of the last year has seen this matchup be just straight unwinnable for the Ice. So it's had its moments, but I think that in a matchup that's as maxed out as this one, I don't know, because it's like back during this time, but it's still like 95-5. This matchup I think is mostly even, but given the fact that life has seen a resurgence in this matchup, I think I can say that this matchup has seen just the slightest trend in favor of life. Even more slight than death in the Ice matchup, which was already very close. But it's like this is a close matchup versus one that's been maxed out forever. So yeah, it's like both of these have seen minimal shifts throughout this past year, in terms of like total and all that. So yeah, that I think is going to be where we leave this matchup. Ice versus Myth is an interesting one. This used to be Ice's worst matchup that wasn't totally unwinnable, apparently a year ago, because Myth did just counter everything that an Ice could do. You know, it's like your weakness, you get stoned. If you shield, you get bared, and all that. And of course, Myth still had things like Gen, which was very hard to work around. But yeah, it was a very bad matchup, to the point where I considered it one of the top 5 worst last August. So that was where that was for quite some time. Even into October, it was still in the bottom 5. but it did see some trends, some positive trends toward the ice, some positive shifts rather toward the ice. And then eventually the stabilized card came out. I'm still perplexed as to why that even was a thing, but once stabilized came out and cards like shift got banned, which also happened within the last year, once that happened, Myth saw a significant decrease in their win rate against ice. And this held for a while. It became one of the closer matchups in the game. Although I guess in April, Cass and I did say it went back into the safe category, just because, like, I guess Myth was performing better at the time, and then, yeah, but May 22nd is when it went back down to a tilt margin, and eventually it would flip as of yesterday's tier list. This is the first time that Ice has been favored in this matchup ever, but yeah, I mean, it had its time being like a close matchup, and it's still in that time being a close matchup. It's just not Myth favored anymore, so this has seen significant trends toward the ice over the last year. I think I can say that now that this is flipped, we can see that ice has really gained a lot on the Myth school. And just the way that Myth plays with things like blade stacking and all that, like ice counters blades, so ice is naturally good against Myth. And ice can also counter negative auras, ice can counter positive auras, so it's like the aura war. If the ice leans more into the aura war, then the ice can win, and that alone has been the reason for why ice has seen positive trends in this matchup. So that, of course, is always good news for ice mains everywhere. And yeah, this has seen a lot of movement toward the ice, which I'm happy about. But it is not like similar to the balance matchup. We are not out of the woods. We have gotten much better in these matchups comparative to like a year ago and for most of the last year, but it is still not a done deal. And honestly, it was this December 19th tier list after the fall update that really changed matters a lot for the myth and balance matchups for ice. It's like stabilized coming out really helped against these two specifically, and that did help a lot. So ice versus balance and ice versus myth have seen significant trends toward ice in recent months, so always good there. Next up is Ice versus Storm, and this has always been kind of a spot of contention. I don't know if I've ever had Storm favored here, but it's pretty consistently been in the likely category for the Ice. It's gone down to lean a couple of times, but yeah, for most of its history, this has been a close matchup, or a closer matchup, I guess, if it's been in the likely category. But yeah, I think this has seen positive trends for the Storm. It's not enough, like, and barely at that. I think we can put it here. So, like, yeah, it's comparative to most of the last year. It's barely gotten better against ice. Now, that being said, if I make a similar video to this in a year, we could probably safely see something like this, or something like that, because healing as a Storm has been what has set Storm apart in this matchup, but for this particular point in time, the data from the last year has suggested that Storm has gotten better against ice. Not by much, definitely not by much, but it's been in a more advantageous position lately. I do think we are going to see some shifts following this, I guess, this next meta and all that, but we're really just going to have to see. I think going forward, Ice is going to perform better against Storm, but for now, Storm has started to do better against Ice in the last year. Healing is still a very important part of Storm in this matchup, but I think that, yeah, I mean, I think it's just going to be, it's the slightest possible trend toward the Storm. But definitely stay tuned for the next one of these tier lists that I'll probably make after the Aquila spell meta has settled. So I don't know if that'll be late July, early August, that sort of thing, but it will happen eventually. Life versus Death is an interesting one because a year ago during the Wraith meta, I had Death on top. August 13th, I had Death on top, but not by as much. And then October 3rd came around. This was when Life really leaned more into that Burrowing Bane type thing and, you know, countering shields, because before Weaving came out, and even after Weaving came out for a little bit, Life was focusing primarily on fire for shield counters and things like, I guess not necessarily trap counters, but shield counters especially were what Life was looking to do, because Death was a bad matchup for them, and you know, it also helped them in the Myth matchup, which is going to be an interesting one to talk about coming soon. But yeah, once that happened, and it got worse as time went on as well, because things like Burrowing Bane were still very, very strong, and they definitely did just a lot. Like Burrowing Bane was the reason for this matchup being favorable for Life, just at all. Death was sort of down after the Wraith ban, or Wraith nerf rather, and so Life sort of jumped up, and you know, things like Burrowing Bane and all that definitely set Life up nicely. And you know, even after the fall update, Life was still doing quite well in this matchup. Death did gain some in that update with Pyre Dragon, but you know, it didn't really help too much against Life. Death really just needed to, Death not carrying dot counters was a big part of this, because of just how strong Burrowing Bane really is. So, or was, I guess, back in the day. So, yep, January's tier list came around and Life was still on top, and then April's tier list came around. This was after Burrowing Bane got turned into bombs. This saw an overwhelming flip back in favor of Death, which is where the devs intended it to be. So Death definitely has seen a much more positive trend. It's been consistently safe for the Death School ever since, and yeah, I mean, it's definitely gotten better for the Death over this last, really just these last few months, since the update is when it's gotten better. So I think that with that in mind, like, the difference between the January tier list and the April tier list is night and day, because this is the difference between, you know, things like before the spring update and after the spring update, when Life dots got turned into bombs. And that was a very vital part for the Death School in this matchup. I think I can say that because of how violently it flipped, I think this has trended safely in favor of the Death. The Death has seen a lot of growth here in this matchup, and it went from being a matchup where, you know, the Death would look and see they got a life and be like, oh, god damn it, you know, I'm just going to get dot spammed and I won't be able to shield, I won't be able to use weaknesses as well, into something that's more like, oh, you know, I got a life, perfect, I can counter their heals, they can't really threaten me as much with damage, they're not weaving fire as much anymore, they're more into weaving like death and myth, I guess I've seen, but, you know, it's not fire, so, you know, I can shield, I can ghoul, I can get good hits off like that, so that, I think, is a good thing for the Death School in this matchup. Next is going to be Life versus Myth, and this one has seen quite an interesting journey. I think this might be the one that's flipped the most, because a year ago I had Myth barely winning this one, in the tilt category, and then it flipped over to a lean life victory, and then back to a lean myth. So again, flip, 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 and then it flipped again a fourth time in November, and then it flipped, or didn't flip, but it expanded significantly between or after the fall update, because myth didn't really get much in that update, and life kind of did, because the more defensive schools that use things like brace more often definitely got a buff in this update with stabilize. So yeah, it definitely got better for life at that point in time. And then January came around, likely life, and then back down to lean life in April, and this is when myth started playing more for things like Jin and I guess like a bunch of blades and all that. So there was that as well. And then in the May tier list, I said it was also lean life, so not much movement there. And then in the most recent one, I said it was likely life. So I think it hasn't seen much movement recently, but it has been a positive trend for life, because every time myth has been up in this matchup, it has not been by much. And then yeah, like myth has had its moments in this matchup where things have sort of come back down and been like a closer matchup, but ultimately speaking, I think life has trended positively in this matchup, and it's doing better than it was like for most of the last year. So that is good for the life school. And next up is Storm versus Life. This has always been one of the most lopsided matchups. Back before Storm sort of figured out the method with like Catch Elf Owl, they weren't doing too hot in this matchup, but once they did, it swung pretty violently toward the Storm. And yeah, I mean, that was the difference. Like a simple meta shift is what caused a swing of this magnitude, and that's where it would stay for a while. And eventually I was putting this as the safest matchup in the game, like the most lopsided matchup in the game was Storm versus Life. And that was like right after the fall update, which was kind of an interesting time to put it there, but metas change and all that. So Storm, I mean, regardless of it, Storm is still doing very, very well against Life. I find it very hard for Life to win in this matchup, just because Storm already does a lot of damage, and it is also a heal counter school. So it's like those are the two things that Life struggles with the most. Wow, I've almost finished this water. I hope I don't need more. But those are the two things that Life has struggled with the most. And yeah, it has just been kind of a double whammy that Life has been stuck with for quite some time. So yeah, for sure, Storm versus Life, very safe for the Storm these days. But ultimately speaking, it has not seen a whole lot of movement. I think it has trended positively for the Storm lately and over the past year, but it hasn't been by a whole lot. It's mostly been stagnant. The matchup has not moved much, but Storm has gotten better against Life, is the point I'm trying to make. So the last matchup we have here is going to be Myth versus Storm. And so a year ago, I put this as, if I can find it, safe Myth as a top 3 worst matchup in the game, apparently, because, you know, Storm struggled with things like shield counters, and, you know, Myth was, like, Jin was still very, very good at this point in time, and Storm just sort of had to deal with that. And yeah, I mean, kind of obvious that Myth was going to do well against Storm in a situation like that where there weren't back in as many shield counters. And then Storm adapted to the meta and saw significant gains in this matchup. It used to be a very bad matchup for the Storm, and then it became much less bad. It was still not favorable, but they were still ahead, but they had gained a lot, rather. Myth was still ahead. And then it flipped in the October tier list. I put it as likely Storm, and that is where it stayed in the November tier list and the December tier list as well. So this is when, you know, Catch Elf Owl coupled with Shrike was at its peak, and after spell weaving, this matchup got much better for the Storm. It moved into safe territory with things like Elephant doing more damage and being better counters. So yeah, safe Storm in January of 25, and that was pretty understandable. But then the ban happened on Storm Elf, and but that we're getting to that. But yeah, it stayed like this through April, and then the ban happened for Storm Elf. And even still, Storm saw like they were still doing fine in the matchup, simply because Catch Shrike Owl was definitely still up, and coupled with the way that Myth had begun to play. And of course, shield counters were still very good for Storm. It's just sort of keeping Myth from being able to Jin was the main deal. And so whenever Storm could do that, they had a much better shot. And it was not that hard for the Storm to do that. So Storm definitely did maintain its advantage, albeit slightly. And it did see a massive shift towards the Myth from the April tier list. But yeah, after the Elf ban, it was like a whole thing. But then it kind of moved back into the safe category, just because it's like more and more Storms started packing more shield counters and all of that, and things like Legend Shield, of course, to help with the Death matchup, but also the Myth matchup, and that definitely moved the needle back toward the Storm. So even without Storm Elf, this is still a very good matchup for the Storm. And, you know, it's like this has seen, honestly, a pretty positive trend for the Storm. So I think we're going to put this probably closer to the left side of the lean category, but it has definitely seen some improvement in that regard. So it did flip in the October tier list compared to August, of course. And yeah, so once that happened in October, it has stayed that way throughout the rest of the last year, including in the tier list immediately after the Elf ban. So yeah, that I think was pretty good for the Storm in that regard. So yeah, okay, I'm starting to get a little fatigued. So that was the last matchup to go over. This is the complete trend tier list in terms of, you know, like the top school in all of these has gotten better against the bottom school over the last year, is what this means. So Death has gotten better against Ice, but not by much. Balance has gotten better against Storm, not by much, but more than, you know, the matchups in the tier above it. Fire has gotten better against Death by a good bit, but not overwhelmingly. And then Ice has gotten just exceedingly better against Balance, but it has not flipped that yet from where it used to be. So that, I think, this is an interesting set of data, because this pretty much means that all of these trends show that some schools have begun to get better. And we're going to be analyzing all of that back on this tab. So, which schools have seen a positive trend and which schools have seen a negative trend in terms of how their matchups look. Let's start with Balance here first, because this is still the best school today and has remained the best school for most of the last year. There was, of course, the December tier list where, you know, everybody was kind of dooming on it because Mana Burn and Supernova had just been banned, and those were pretty integral cards, but it definitely climbed back up in the months following that. So Balance, when compared to its last year, I guess, it's seen positive trends in the Fire matchup, the Storm matchup, and honestly very positive trends in the death and life matchups. It has only really seen substantial losses in the safe matchup, or in the ice matchup, which was very safe, one-sided even way back, but it's gotten much better for the ice, but it's not like a loss. So with that in mind, seeing as Balance has seen 4 positive trends in terms of matchups, as well as having 2 of the top 5 best trends, I think we can safely say that Balance is seeing a positive trend over this last year. So there is that. Even despite the Mana Burn and Supernova Ban, those 2 cards were staples in the Balance's arsenal for quite some time. For like 12 years, as a matter of fact. That came out in Avalon in 2012 and then finally got banned in the fall of 24. So even despite those 2 cards getting banned, Balance is seeing a positive trend. Next up is the Death School, and basing the metrics off of what we saw in the Wraith meta, which is when I made my first tier list, and Death was winning 5 of its matchups. Yeah, it's like going off of some of that data, it's seen positive trends in 3 of its matchups, but it's seen negative trends in like a matchup that it was already losing by a lot, but also in 2 of the most common matchups in the queue. And that, I think, to me, has shown me that Death has seen a negative trend. It has gotten worse over the last year, but it's definitely not a bad school right now. I put it in 2nd place as of this last tier list, but it is definitely not what it once was. So Death has gotten worse over the last year, but right now it is still quite good. So definitely, I would still recommend playing Death, and I feel like it's going to start to see some positive shifts in terms of some of its matchups. Like the Ice matchup might end up flipping from, being unfavorable to Death to favorable to Death after Poison becomes more readily accessible. Like the Spellments start ending up in the Event Spellamental pack. Once that happens, I think that Death will see some positive shifts there. So yeah, so it's like, it's gotten worse over the last year, but don't fret if you're a Death main. It'll probably get better in this next meta, that sort of thing. So next on the list is Fire, and Fire, Fire honestly has seen, like, it's got these 2 matchups where it's gotten better, but Fire has mostly been stagnant in terms of its trends. It's gotten the slightest bit worse against Balance, the slightest bit worse against Storm, which was a matchup that it was losing anyway, and the needles moved in favor of the Ice, but Fire is still winning that. I think this is a similar case to Death in the sense that it is not as good as it's been getting progressively worse over the last year, and especially as of this last update, where you can't infinitely chain dots like you used to. Like a defining feature of this tier list is no longer, it's been undone in this one. So it's like there's that, and I think Fire has seen a negative trend. I don't know if it's going to continue down that route, but that is what I think we are going to see. I think Fire is going to get worse going forward, but it is still going to be viable. I think I did put this in 3rd place on my last tier list. So there's that. Ice is the next one up, and I think we finally, at long last, have some good news for Ice players. I think that even though Ice has seen negative trends in 3 of its matchups, these have been stagnant, more or less. And like a good Ice can beat a good Storm. Ice is still favored a little bit against Death, and it wasn't winning the life matchup anyway, but the matchups in which it's gotten better, it has seen overwhelmingly good trends in the Myth matchup and in the Balance matchup, and we now have something resembling a fighting chance against fire, given the trends. So I think ice has had, honestly speaking, more positive trends than balance. I think ice, we're going to end up finding out that once all of this is done, that ice has gotten better over the last year by the most. It's still not a good school. I put it at 7th out of 7 on my last tier list, and for most of my last tier lists. But it is much better now than it used to be. So it's sort of become like a high skill ceiling school. I think ice is getting better and will continue to get better, but it's not great right now. I could see ice becoming a meta school in another year if the devs make the right decisions surrounding ice. But yeah, for right now, ice has gotten much better over the last year. It's still not great, but it's gotten better, and that, I think, counts for something. Life is the next one, and it has seen, honestly, mostly negative trends. I'm gonna be real. After, because like gnomes got nerfed, you know, and it's like heal counters have consistently been getting buffed. It lost its main offensive route. I think life has seen the worst trends out of any of the schools so far. I think I am gonna have to refill my water. I'm almost out, but yeah. So life has seen much worse trends over this last year. Like the counters to their heals have definitely gotten better and more accessible, and they've lost Burrowing Bane, which was a very oppressive card. Like you can see in like the January tier list, it was winning its a matchup that it was supposed to lose, as designed by the devs, just off of that. And yeah, overall, life has gotten worse, and it's, I think that's a good thing. I think any match, or any meta rather, where life is a good school is not a fun one. So life being on a negative trend, make it that what you will. Next on the list is Myth, and this one is kind of all over the place. It's 3 and 3. It's got 3 positive trends and 3 negative trends, but I think, like, just because the 3 positive trends aren't by much and the 3 negative trends are by more substantial margins, I think we can say that Myth has been on a negative trend, but just ever so slightly. And the main reason for that, I want to say, is just because, like, Reg Myth used to be very strong, but there's just, like, better... The other schools have kind of gotten better against it, if that makes sense. So, I don't know. I think... Yeah, it's hard to tell. I think Myth has gotten worse over the last year, for sure. But it hasn't been by too much. It's been mostly stagnant. Yeah, it's been mostly stagnant, and I'm trying to figure out how to order these. I think the further to the left they are, the, I guess, more positive it should be, even in both. So it's like the Life School has seen the worst trend, Ice has seen the best so far. That's sort of just what I mean by that. So the last one to go over is going to be the Storm School, and honestly, I'm looking at this right now. Storm seems to be on a positive trend. Not by as much as Ice or Balance, but Storm, I think, has been getting better, mostly because cards like Catch, cards like Shrike are very helpful. Obviously, Storm Owl is still just an absolute hammer, and ultimately, yeah, I think Storm has gotten better over the last year, and most of that has been because, you know, Storm has like worked out the meta a bit more. Things like negative auras and aura wars help it out a lot. in certain matchups, and obviously like Storms can still heal in the matchups where that's good. And all in all, I think Storm is looking better now than it was before. So yeah, honestly, that's about an hour and 15-minute video that I just did, just knocked out. So this is where I think, like, these are the schools, these 3 have been getting better over the last year, and these 4 have been getting worse over the last year. Of course, these could all change depending on the devs' perspective and just like where they want to take some of these schools. The meta is still ever evolving. We did get a big Rochambeau update in the last year, of course, being the Star School, I guess, update to it, where auras and all of that, it's like negative auras coming in and like really shaking things up a lot. That, I think, helped a ton with back to presentation mode. Hit a mouse button by accident. But yeah, it's like those that big spell update was it was pretty groundbreaking for this last year, and I think that did shake things up. And of course, schools like Ice and Balance benefited a lot from it. So yeah, I think that's that's probably a good place to end things for this video. So yeah, overall, these are the trends of every matchup, and these are the schools that have been getting better and the schools that have been getting worse over the past year. I think we could see this come up here. I think we could see Death get better over this next year, especially once Poison becomes more accessible. But for this last year, this is where things stand. So with that in mind, thank you all for watching. I've been Ice Gold. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave like 50 comments for the algorithm. My Discord is down in the description if you want to chat with me some more, and I will see y'all later.